For 30 years, 5 nights a week, he was the most reliable presence in America. He wasn't just a TV host, he was a cultural institution, a familiar friend who tucked the nation into bed with a joke and a gentle goodnight. He was the king of late night, the man who sat behind a simple desk in Burbank, California, and commanded the loyalty of tens of millions of people. His name was Johnny Carson, and from the outside, his life looked like a masterpiece of success. He had the wit, the charm, the power, and the adoration of an entire country. But fame can be a strange and lonely fortress. The man who seemed to know everyone, who could make anyone laugh, from Hollywood royalty to the guy next door, was, in reality, a ghost in his own life, a figure so private, so guarded, that almost no one ever saw past the curtain. And when that curtain finally fell for the last time, it revealed a story that was anything but funny. For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the most famous man in America. He was welcomed into millions of homes every single night, a familiar friend who could make anyone laugh. But when the king of late night finally stepped away from his throne, the laughter stopped, and the friendships vanished. This is the story of how the man everyone thought they knew chose to spend his final years in a profound and tragic isolation. To understand the silence of Johnny Carson's final years, you first have to understand the noise of his life. Born in Corning, Iowa, in 1925, and raised in Norfolk, Nebraska, John William Carson was a product of the American heartland. People always said his Midwestern roots were the secret to his massive appeal. He was a steady, relatable guy in the crazy world of entertainment. His journey didn't start with punchlines, but with magic. As a teenager, he performed as the Great Carsoni, an early peek at the showman who would one day captivate a nation. After a stint in the Navy during World War II, he went to the University of Nebraska, sharpened his skills on local radio, and then made the jump to television. After a few early TV gigs, including hosting the game show, Who Do You Trust?, Carson was offered the biggest job in the new world of late-night television. In 1962, he took over from Jack Paar as the host of NBC's The Tonight Show. He was actually hesitant to take the job at first, and the ratings wobbled for about a year. But soon enough, Carson found his rhythm, and in doing so, he didn't just host the show, he became the show. For the next 3 decades, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson wasn't just a program, it was a national ritual. That set was his kingdom. From his desk, with his ever-loyal sidekick Ed McMahon by his side, Carson held court. He created the format that nearly every late-night show still copies today. The opening monologue, the banter with the bandleader, the guest couch, and the comedy sketches. Characters like Aunt Blabby, Floyd Ark Turbo, and the all-knowing Karnak the Magnificent became household names. His genius wasn't in being louder than his guests, but in creating a space where they could be their best. He was a master listener with an almost supernatural sense of comic timing. A raised eyebrow, a wry smile, a perfectly timed pause after a bad joke, these were the tools of a master who could get huge laughs without saying a word. For a young comedian, getting called over to the couch by Johnny after your stand-up set was everything. It was a coronation. A wave from the king meant your career was made. David Letterman, Jay Leno, Joan Rivers, Jerry Seinfeld, Billy Crystal, George Carlin, the list of comedy legends who got their big break on his stage shows just how powerful he was. As David Letterman would later say, he was the man they all wanted to impress. His influence was staggering. At his peak, NBC was making over $55 million a year from the show, which would be well over $200 million today. In a 1980 contract negotiation, he cut a deal that was unheard of. It not only paid him a massive salary but also gave his own company, Carson Productions, ownership of the show and its massive tape library. He was more than a host, he was a magnate, one of the most powerful men in entertainment. When he announced his retirement in 1991, it felt like a national shockwave. Bob Hope famously said it was like a head falling off Mount Rushmore. His final week on air was a national event, a long, emotional goodbye. On his last show, May 22, 1992, an estimated 50 million people tuned in. That final night, sitting on a lone stool, he was gracious and humble, a Midwestern gentleman to the end. He didn't end with a big flourish, but with a simple, heartfelt message: "I bid you a very heartfelt good night." And then, the curtain fell. And Johnny Carson, the most public man in America, simply disappeared. When Johnny Carson left The Tonight Show, everyone expected a slow fade. Maybe a few guest appearances, hosting the Oscars, a couple of primetime specials. What they got instead was nothing. A deafening silence. He didn't just retire from his job, he retired from public life, completely and totally. He gave only 2 major interviews in all the years that followed and turned down every single request for tributes and appearances, even from his closest friends. So why the abrupt and total retreat? To understand that, you have to look past the charming guy on TV and into the shadows of his private life, a world filled with emotional distance, deep-seated grudges, and a tragedy that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Behind that easy smile was a man many found to be cold, aloof, and fiercely private. Staffers who worked with him for decades would admit they never really knew him. He was polite but distant, professional but guarded. He famously refused to meet his guests before they walked through the curtain, wanting every reaction on camera to be real. While that made for great television, it was also how he lived his life. He built impenetrable walls around himself. His friend and fellow host Dick Cavett remembered how socially awkward Carson could be, saying you could see him straining to be friendly with fans, just desperate to get away. His longtime lawyer and friend, Henry Bushkin, later wrote a book about a complex and often cruel man who was as difficult off-camera as he was brilliant on it. This emotional detachment wrecked his personal relationships. Carson was married 4 times, and 3 of them ended in bitter, expensive divorces. He admitted later in life that his work always came first, that he gave more of himself to the show than to anyone at home. He was a known womanizer, yet according to Bushkin, he had a constant need to be married. His 3rd wife, Joanna Holland, was with him for over a decade, but friends said he would often just pull away from her, avoiding any real emotional conversation. His 4th and final wife, Alexis Moss, was with him until he died, and many said their relationship was his calmest. Still, the emotional habits of a lifetime are hard to break. The walls he'd spent decades building were just too high to tear down. Nowhere was this emotional distance more damaging than with his 3 sons, Chris, Corey, and Rick. His work schedule kept him away, and even when he was home, he couldn't seem to connect with them. His own difficult relationship with his mother, Ruth, whom he described as domineering and emotionally cold, seemed to cast a long shadow. He once told his lawyer he didn't go to her funeral, reportedly saying, "The wicked witch is dead." He seemed to pass that same inherited coldness down to his own kids, creating a deep rift between them. The most troubled of his sons was Rick. Rick struggled with mental health issues for years, including depression and substance abuse. Johnny rarely talked about it publicly, and those close to the family say their relationship was filled with missed chances to connect. Then, on June 21, 1991, just a year before Carson retired, tragedy struck. Rick Carson, a nature photographer, was driving on a coastal highway in California when his car plunged down a 125-foot embankment. He was only 39 years old. The loss destroyed Carson. He was eaten up by guilt and regret over their broken relationship. He told close friends he wished he had been a better father. True to his nature, he grieved in private. He took 4 weeks off from the show but didn't attend his son's memorial service, apparently to keep it from turning into a media circus. When he returned to the air, he fought back tears as he paid a brief, heartbreaking tribute to his son from behind his desk. He showed a photo of a sunset Rick had taken and said, "He was a good guy. When Rick was around, you wanted to smile." Those who knew him best, like bandleader Doc Severinsen, said that after Rick's death, Johnny was never the same. The tragedy seemed to cement his decision to retreat from the world. Compounding his isolation was another defining trait, his ability to hold a grudge. When Johnny Carson felt betrayed, there was no coming back. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized. And no story shows this better than his infamous feud with Joan Rivers. For years, Joan was his protégée. She was his most reliable guest host and a close friend. He was the one who gave her a national stage. In 1983, he made her his permanent guest host, the official heir to the throne. But in 1986, the new Fox network offered her a deal The Tonight Show couldn't match, her very own late-night show. Fearing Carson would kill the deal if she told him beforehand, and pushed by her husband, she took the offer without talking to her mentor. She called him to tell him the news, but he refused to take her call. When he heard it from someone else, he felt completely betrayed. When she finally got him on the phone, he hung up on her, and he never spoke to her again. Ever. He didn't just cut her off personally, he blacklisted her from The Tonight Show. For the rest of his time as host, and even during Jay Leno's tenure, her name was forbidden on the show. Staffers called it the Joan embargo. The feud had devastating results. Rivers' show on Fox struggled after Carson allegedly pressured guests not to appear, and it was cancelled in just over a year. Tragically, her husband, Edgar, who took the blame for the show's failure, took his own life a few months later. Shattered, Joan tried to reach out to Johnny again. Her calls were never answered. Years later, after his son Rick died, she sent a heartfelt condolence note. She got a cold, formal reply from an assistant. The door was locked forever. This pattern of cutting people out, of nursing grudges in silence, was just who he was. It made his world smaller and smaller, pushing away friends, colleagues, and even family. By the time he walked off that stage in 1992, the emotional walls were fully built. The death of his son had left a wound that would never heal, and the grudges he carried were heavy, permanent baggage. The king was retreating into his castle, pulling up the drawbridge for good. We're about to get into what his life was really like after he walked away. If you find these deep dives into the true stories behind iconic figures compelling, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. After his final show, Johnny Carson retreated to his massive, cliff-top mansion in Malibu, a beautiful fortress overlooking the Pacific Ocean. For the millions who had watched him every night, he basically ceased to exist. His life, once a public spectacle, became a quiet, tightly controlled routine of extreme privacy. The sudden silence was exactly what he wanted. It was the final step in a life spent building emotional walls. His days fell into a predictable, solitary rhythm. He was a huge reader and would spend hours with books. He played the drums and had a telescope for stargazing. He played tennis regularly and spent a lot of time on his yacht, often sailing alone. He was a man with all the money and time in the world, but his social circle had shrunk to almost nothing. As his old sidekick Ed McMahon once put it, he was great with 10 million people, lousy with 10. He kept his contact with the outside world to a bare minimum. He was fiercely protective of his privacy, turning down every single request for interviews and public appearances. The few people still in his orbit were a small, trusted group. He stayed friends with David Letterman and would occasionally fax him jokes for his monologue, a quiet way of keeping his hand in the craft he'd perfected. After Carson's death, Letterman opened a show with a monologue made up entirely of jokes Johnny had sent him, a moving tribute to his invisible mentor. Close friends like Don Rickles and his former producer Peter LaSalle would check in, but visit were rare. Rickles once talked about visiting Johnny at his Malibu home and finding him just sitting alone on his balcony, staring out at the ocean. There was a sense that even those he let inside his fortress could never really reach the man inside. His lawyer, Henry Bushkin, whose own relationship with Carson eventually soured, painted a picture of a man who used his wealth not to connect, but to isolate himself even more. He hated small talk, and the charm he used so effortlessly on camera was a tool he refused to use in his private life. This isolation was his choice, but it was also a kind of prison. He had spent his entire adult life being Johnny Carson, a public character that took immense control to maintain. In retirement, he no longer had the nightly release of the show, which left him alone with his thoughts, his regrets, and his ghosts. The death of his son Rick was still a deep, unspoken sorrow. The grudges he held, like the one against Joan Rivers, were never resolved, leaving wounds to fester in the silence. He had built his life like a fortress to keep the world out, but in his final years, he found himself trapped inside it. Then, his physical health began to reflect his emotional isolation. He had been a heavy smoker for most of his life, a habit you could see on air in the show's early years, and the damage was done. He reportedly quit in the 1970s, but it was too late. In March 1999, he had a severe heart attack and needed quadruple bypass surgery. It was a harsh reminder of his own mortality, but he handled it with his usual privacy, releasing almost no information to the public. In September 2002, the news broke that he had been diagnosed with emphysema, a progressive and brutal lung disease. He confirmed the diagnosis but played down how serious it was, denying he was terminally ill. True to form, he refused to ask for public sympathy or talk about his condition. He faced his illness the same way he faced everything else in his personal life, silently, stoically, and alone. As the emphysema got worse, his world shrank even more. The man who once commanded a stage in front of millions was now stuck at home, his breath getting shorter, his energy gone. His final conversations were with a tiny circle of people. He spoke to his brother, Dick, and reportedly admitted the cause of his illness with a raspy whisper, "Those damn cigarettes." On the morning of January 23, 2005, Johnny Carson died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official cause of death was respiratory failure from emphysema. He was 79 years old. His wife, Alexis, was by his side. In a final act of total privacy, there was no public memorial service. His body was cremated, and his ashes were given to his wife. The man who had lived in the public eye for 3 decades was put to rest in complete secrecy. The contrast was incredible. 50 million people had watched his final broadcast, a sign of his immense connection with the public. In the end, his world had shrunk to just a handful of people, a quiet, lonely departure for the undisputed king of late night. The laughter had faded long ago, and all that was left was the profound silence he had built for himself. Putting these stories together takes a ton of research to bring you the full picture. If you appreciate the deep dive, please do us a favor and like this video and leave a comment below. What's your most memorable Johnny Carson moment? We read all your comments. The news of Johnny Carson's death sent a wave of grief across the country. Tributes poured in from everywhere. President George W. Bush issued a statement. Jay Leno, the man who inherited The Tonight Show desk, called him the gold standard of television. He dedicated a whole show to Carson's memory, where old guests like Don Rickles and Bob Newhart shared stories, often fighting back tears. David Letterman, the man many people, including Carson himself, saw as his true successor, gave one of the most powerful tributes. "All of us who came after are pretenders," Letterman said. "We will not see the likes of him again." He talked about how Carson had given him his career and how, even years later, he would still find himself thinking, what would Johnny have done? It was a feeling shared by countless comedians who owed their entire careers to one good night on his show. You can't overstate his legacy in television. He didn't just host a show, he perfected a genre. His wit, his class, and his ability to connect with an audience every single night for 30 years set a bar that still hasn't been matched. He was a calming presence through decades of turbulence, a figure of unity when the media landscape was starting to fracture. For an hour each night, he brought the country together for a laugh, but the story of Johnny Carson is really a tale of two men. There was the public icon, the charming host who was a welcome guest in every living room in America. And then there was the private man, a deeply complex figure filled with unresolved sadness. He was a man who craved solitude but was haunted by loneliness. He was a master of communication who couldn't seem to express his own feelings to the people he should have been closest to. He could hold an audience of millions in the palm of his hand but couldn't hold on to his marriages or build deep bonds with his own children. The walls he built to protect himself from the pressures of fame ultimately became his prison. The emotional armor he wore to survive in the spotlight left him isolated in the dark. The death of his son Rick was a tragedy he never recovered from, a wound that pushed him further away from the world. His inability to forgive, most famously with Joan Rivers, left him surrounded by the ghosts of broken friendships. In the end, Johnny Carson's story is a powerful cautionary tale about the dark side of fame. It's a reminder that the person on the screen is just an image. Behind the laughter, there can be incredible pain. Behind the adoring crowd, there can be profound isolation. He was the king of late night, a title he earned and absolutely deserved. But he paid a heavy price for that crown, spending his final years in a self-imposed exile, a lonely monarch in a gilded cage. He left the world quietly, just as he had lived his final 13 years. But his legacy is anything but quiet. It lives on in every late-night monologue, in every comedian who got their start on his stage, and in the collective memory of a nation that, for 3 decades, really felt like they knew him. The tragedy is that, in the end, almost no one truly did.